Hello! Today we're taking a closer look at the Eikons of Final Fantasy XVI, which are the latest rendition of Final Fantasy's recurring summons, and an interesting take on the deities that have increasingly taken centre stage over the years, and in the past few Final Fantasy games. Now, as a quick overview, the Eikons in Final Fantasy XVI are perhaps the most similar to how we saw them in Final Fantasy XIII, which is to say, rather than abilities that are usable by a dedicated summoner class, like in Final Fantasy IX, Final Fantasy X, or Final Fantasy XV, or being an equipable free-for-all sort of ability, like in Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy VIII, they are instead allotted to specific characters that we encounter in the game, such as Lightning having Odin in Final Fantasy XIII, Snow having Shiva, and so on. And more often than not, through the games, they are shown to be beings of a separate nature. They have their own sentience, personalities, and sometimes even civilizations, with the Espers of Final Fantasy VI being a prime example of that. In Final Fantasy VIII, we see them being these beast-like yet autonomous sentient beings that are comprised of magical energy, with Ifrit, Odin, and Bahamut, for example, speaking directly to the party and challenging them to battle. And they are also shown to be aware of one another. So, for example, we have Ifrit mentioning Shiva when we battle him in the Fire Cavern. And conversely, in other games like Final Fantasy X, which is perhaps most in keeping with Final Fantasy XVI's manifestation of them, where they are not specifically autonomous sentient beings, but rather they are conjured by dreams of the faith to take corporeal form in the real world, to assist Yuna, their summoner. Now, turning to Final Fantasy XVI, it has a pretty interesting take on the Eikons when we account for this legacy stuff, because not only are they like the Final Fantasy XIII summons in how they are specific to individuals, and also like Final Fantasy X in how they are conjured out of immaterial energy, known as Aether in this game, rather than the faith, but they are also conjured in a way that transforms the summoner themselves. And so, in many ways, they might be seen as automatons that are humanoid, or indeed animoid, by appearance only, because, for example, a fully primed appearance of Ramu, or Rama, or Garuda, doesn't come with a personality, or an external being that exhibits free will, but quite to the contrary, despite being this monstrous force, we are still conversing and communicating with Cid, or Benedicta, or whoever the dominant transforming into that summon might be. So this is quite unique, and it's fine, and it's interesting for the lore of Final Fantasy XVI, and I think the easiest way to think about the summons is as a high level, or indeed the highest level of a given elemental magic. So for example, well, we have the element of earth, and we have the element of ice. We could think the most extreme ethereal concentration of that is Titan and Shiva, respectively, which is reflected in their mother crystals and a number of factors like that. But there are a number of things within this game that make us question whether the Eikons are more than mere concentrations of elemental magic, and is something that I found myself questioning throughout the game. Firstly, the most obvious factor is that these beings take on an obviously sentient form, in keeping with all of the summons that we see in Final Fantasy games. But this is nothing new, and if we look more broadly at popular anime tropes, we have humans inhabiting giant sentient-looking vessels, whether that's the Avas in Neon Genesis, or the transformative titans like Eren Yeager in Attack on Titan. And these giants have no inherent consciousness unto themselves, so it's not something that's completely removed from sort of Japanese media. However, what makes Final Fantasy XVI slightly more complex is the fact that our central hero Clive is seen to be periodically losing control to the impulse of the Eikon Ifrit, hinting that these beings are something exterior to the dominant themselves, and at least on some level perhaps have a form of consciousness about them. And we later see Clive, for example, calling to Ifrit as if he is kind of calling out to an external sentient being, and something that could consciously respond to that. Conversely, we could argue that Ifrit and the other Eikons are indeed merely vessels appended to and attuned to the will of their dominant, and perhaps it is specific stresses and emotional triggers that causes Clive to prime throughout the game. Because, of course, most instances of Ifrit manifesting come at particularly tragic times and emotionally taxing times, starting with the demise of Clive's father and the perceived demise of his brother Joshua. The second factor, which is a bit crazy, is the eerie antagonist of Sleipnir. Now, Sleipnir, according to the lore of the game, was summoned into being using the powers of the Eikon Odin. And I suppose it adds another layer of consideration to this, because, of course, Sleipnir is, for all intents and purposes, a sentient human being created out of the powers of the Eikons. So whether or not they're conscious and sentient themselves, they're certainly capable of creating something that does have consciousness. So it's an interesting observation, and one that's cropped up around the place as Final Fantasy fans have played through Final Fantasy 16 and watched this story unfold. And I suppose, as products of Ultima, just as the Fallen were, just as human beings were, before obtaining consciousness, it seems that despite the volatile Ifrit periodically obstructing Clive, the Eikons were intended to be empty vessels as well. And this is a stark departure from legacy games, where the summons were always these godlike deities who dwelled within alternate dimensions, or like in Final Fantasy 15, were actually creator gods who ruled over the realms of men, which was a really interesting take. And while I personally always preferred the slightly more combative sort of summons that you would need to win over and obtain, like in Final Fantasy 8, Final Fantasy 10, Final Fantasy 13, it was certainly a very interesting kind of renewed look at how to use these Final Fantasy tropes, and to have these transformative vessels dwelling within humans themselves, whether or not they were actually sentient. So there we have it, a short discussion and a short consideration of one of the weirder yet more unique aspects of lore within Final Fantasy 16 that I never quite got my head around, and I thought was worth kind of throwing out there, because I'm not sure if anyone else has picked up on any lore in the game that would clarify the status of the summons. If you got this far, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And let me know what you made of this fresh take on the summonable deities of Final Fantasy.